Game books, as most of you know, are a form of interactive fiction that was all the rage in the 1980s and then early 1990s still, until the market crashed almost overnight around 94, 95. By 97, most of the historical series had been closed down. But then there was this unexpected thing that early 2000s and from the 2010s especially, we started having a second wave of game books, which is not as big and popular and mainstream as the first wave was, but has something interesting. It has become more varied and more creative because of one important change. Now adults are interested in game books. There is no doubt that almost every reader of game books in the 1980s was either a child or a teenager or a teenager. Or if you had the occasional adult that read them, well, still those books weren't marketed mainly for them. As far as I know, only the Sorcery series spin-off of Fighting Fantasy was marketed explicitly for adults. Hundreds or thousands of other books were for children. Now in the 2010s, 2020s, when we have game books specifically designed for adults, these game books can be different and can cover different topics. We have now sex in game books, drugs, crazy stuff, gory violence, and even the most taboo adult topics of them all. The workplace, because that is the thing that usually you don't find in game books, you don't want in game books so much, because that's very often what you want to escape from. And yet there is a tradition, a small tradition of parody of game books that kind of look like choose your own adventure books or fighting fantasy books that have to do with the dreary life of working adults, and very often has a very strong satirical tone. Game books such as The Most Boring Game Books Ever Written, yeah, that's the title, or The Office Adventure. There are several examples, and this one is one. The Citadel of Bureaucracy, the first in the Fighting Reality series. So as you can see clearly, this is an homage of and parody of Fighting Fantasy, from the iconic green spine to the overall design. The name, the title, of course, it reminds us of the second Fighting Fantasy book, The Citadel of Chaos, but it is about bureaucracy. In this book, you're a civil servant. You're working in a bureaucratic job that I personally don't understand. I don't know if it's like in some of those cartoons where you're not supposed to really know what the office does, or I don't get it because I'm not familiar enough with that. But that's what you're gonna do. You go to the office and you talk to boring people and annoying people, and they send your reports where they shouldn't be sent, and you go to meetings and you dread going to those meetings, and you have to deal with dirty microwave ovens in the recreational areas, and you have to deal with rude and annoying people, all again within a framework of fighting fantasy, of course, with 400 sections. That is the iconic thing. I'm not going to show it too much to you because I don't want to give you spoilers. 400 sections, and there's even a game, there are game mechanics that are very similar to Fighting Fantasy, but now the fights that still work in the same system, resolved within the same system, Fighting Fantasy, they represent different things. Maybe they represent that you're trying to convince somebody. They're confrontations rather than physical fights. It can be against a human being, or it can be against your hesitations, your fears, etc., etc., etc. And it's very interesting that the whole thing, again, the encounters, you see how some of these human beings that you meet, actually they're modeled after traditional monsters of fantasy or Fighting Fantasy specifically. Instead of the trolls, you have the chain smoking trolls, people that smoke in front of this no smoking sign, and things like that, and also the Canada Goose. It's on the cover. They mention it here, so I don't think it's a spoiler for me to mention that. So you're trying to survive and even to thrive in a day in 2019. where you go to your job and things happen to you. Again, I'm going to be vague as I usually am when I review game books because I don't want to give away the surprise. Satire and parody. The parody side works very well because it really feels like, for the most part, it feels like a fairly easy game-wise, fairly easy fighting fantasy game with a modern theme. Fighting fantasy games are usually devilishly difficult. Here, reaching the optimal ending wasn't all that tough to me, so there is that. But again, clearly the point was mainly about the ambiance, the atmosphere, and the satire. So the parody feels like a vehicle for the satire rather than just being, oh, I'm going to make fun of fighting fantasy books. They're really using that framework to say something else. So as a fighting fantasy book, you can enjoy it as a fairly easy one. And maybe from time to time that is good also. The book even gives us the option of playing in story mode. I know we didn't have those in game books of the 1980s. The difficulty level was fixed then. But here it says, no, if you want, you can just cheat fairly and play in story mode. And so pretending that you pass all the tests and you win all the confrontations. And so that's interesting. Not that really this book invents story mode, but it's one of the books that acknowledges that we have been doing those things. We have had story modes in game books for 40 years now, which is cool. A lot earlier, in my opinion, than it became standard or it became really mainstream. Some video games of the 1980s had that also, but not as universal. Game books was always universal that you have story mode available. It wasn't acknowledged, now it is. When it comes to the execution, though, I mean, it's possibly because the topic is not super interesting to me. I don't work in administration, I don't work in bureaucracy. I have the luck of not having to spend a lot of time on my workplace. I work mostly at home. I teach in college, so I prepare my class at home. I review things, I grade stuff, and then I go to college, I go to the classroom. I'm not stuck in the same physical place. And my colleagues are awesome, so even if I was, that wouldn't be a problem at all. So maybe I don't relate too much to that, so I may not be the perfect audience for this. But a lot of people that like game books these days, play board games these days, watch my video, they are from the middle class and probably they have office-based jobs. Maybe that was more relevant before the pandemic. Maybe some of you don't have to be in the physical space quite as much. So this book may relate more to you because from the point of view of the execution, from the point of view of actually reading each scene, reading each interaction, after a while it got a little uninteresting to me, felt a little repetitive, and again the joke got old, but probably, and again, I didn't see all the angles. You're like, oh my gosh, that's exactly what happens to me. Oh my gosh, that's exactly the person next door. So to me, the satire felt a little bit abstract, but again, I'm telling you with the big disclaimer that you may feel very different if indeed you have an emotional stake in the topic. So I'm always happy to take a look at new game books, and this game book with this interesting element of nostalgia, because there is honest, sincere nostalgia for fighting fantasy, while at the same time using that as a satire of today's workplace. And so to me, it was more interesting than fun. But if the topic of the book is one that resonates with you, I think it can be pretty fun for you too.